I wanted to again welcome everyone back from lunch and also welcome our new guests today to this wonderful symposium. My name is Alok Sharan. I'm an orthopedic spine surgeon at Montefiore Medical Center in the Bronx, New York, and I have the distinct honor and pleasure of introducing our first speaker, Professor Giovanni Gavetti. So I think that it's pretty clear that all of us know that healthcare is changing, and I would venture to say that everyone here has a pretty strong vision of where we want healthcare to go. I think the question, though, is how do we get to that point? How do we get from where we are today to this ideal state that all of us have a vision for? And I think that we're really fortunate to have one of the world's leading experts on change management and strategy speaking to us today about how we're going to get from where we are today to where we need to go in the future. Professor Gavetti has a very impressive resume. I'm not going to spend too much time because it would take forever to go through his whole resume. But Professor Gavetti did his training in Milan, Italy, and after spending some time at the University of Pennsylvania, he spent many years on the faculty in the Harvard Strategy Unit. But Tuck was really fortunate to have him come here in 2012, and since then he's been teaching classes on strategy, and actually one of the classes that he teaches to the Tuck Business School students was one of the most favorite classes for the students that last year he was voted as Teacher of the Year, which I think is a really, from what I understand, a very distinct honor here in the Tuck Business School. So I think on behalf of all of us, we'd like to thank you for helping us understand how we get from where we are today to where we need to get to in the future.
Well, thank you very much for the kind introduction, and good afternoon, everybody. Very happy to be here. A couple of things. First of all, this is going to be a case discussion, not a lecture. So, we are all going to talk and have a chat about these issues. Second, I chose Kodak because I think that there are a few insights from the case that, in my view, are fairly important to healthcare as well. I also teach the healthcare class, and in fact have a former student of mine here, Brett, who co-wrote the case for us. And my idea is to teach the entire course, strategy course, on the basis of cases written by students, and that was the first actually case taught, or the second, written by students. Kodak is a very complex company. It's probably the most complex companies that I've ever thought about and written about. And probably, the only industry is more complex and the only situation is more complex than Kodak's is, in fact, healthcare. But, the idea, the image that I have, I'm Italian, I like to cook. And, the image that I have when I think of Kodak is one of these big red fat onions with, hundreds of layers. And it takes a lot of peeling to get to the really good stuff. That's what I think, that's what Kodak evokes to me, that image. And the idea for today is to, I will try to kind of walk you through a shortcut to what really matters. There are lots of things that have been going on in that company, but there is something that is really core to it that is very hard to see. And so we are going to have to take a little bit of a shortcut to get there, okay? A couple of things before getting started. First of all, a few highlights from the case. Can you all read? Can you all see what I wrote here? Okay, so, in the case really goes back to the 80s. I mean, most of the action occurred in the 80s, especially when Sony in 1980 showcases the Mavica, the first digital camera. At that time, as the case makes pretty clear, Kodak was a fantastic company. It was, the best company in the industry. It was monopolist in this country, more or less. Worldwide, it was the leader. Fuji was actually kind of a competitor, monopoly. In a sense, Fuji is the mirror image of Kodak, but in Asia, in particular in Japan, fantastic brand, one of the top 5 or top 10 brands in the world at that time. Everybody knew Kodak. Everyone who has watched the movie, at the end of the movie, there was always the Kodak logo. And more than anything else, it's a printing money machine, okay? So this is one of the most profitable companies in the country. Great culture, strong identity, long history, okay? So key facts here, throughout the 80s, this company invests a lot of money into digital imaging. In fact, 50% of its R&D budget. And Polaroid, actually, which is an interesting comparison, at that time was doing more or less the same. These investments actually paid off. In the early 90s, the companies had great technologies. I was talking to one of the executives at that time, and in the early 90s, actually Sony was coming to Kodak to buy sensors. So they were really at the leading edge of the sensor technology. As we know, George Fisher comes in from Motorola in 1994. He tries to change the company. He tries to tell them, you guys need to sell cameras, not only film. So we're not a film company. We are what did he say? We are an imaging company. We're in the picture business. And we can make money both in terms of selling the cameras and selling film. Looked like a pretty reasonable proposition back then. The company has been pushing for a long time, especially through the 90s, the notion of photo CD. The idea of photo CD, the idea of selling CDs so that you can load on CDs pictures and essentially make money on that, on the CD itself. Okay, so that's kind of a little bit of a premise here. Before getting started with our discussion, there is something really important for everybody to do and to think about. Okay, for this discussion to be meaningful, we all have to go back to the time of the case. It would be pretty bad for us to approach the case from the point of view of what we know today. So let's try to go back in time at the time of the case in the early 80s. These are examples of high-tech products at that time. Okay. You know what that is? You remember what that is? What is that? A Polaroid, Color Pack 85. I took, that's an 80. But I had the 85, which was one of the best Christmas gifts that I've ever had. And it made me, I was this old, and it made me very happy. One of the first PCs. You know what that is? Any British people here? Do you remember that? That's a Spectral, a Sinclair, I believe, video game console. Do you know what that is? Commodore 64. That's the American response to that. You remember the video games that we were playing back then? Pong. Yes. Or Space Invaders, maybe. That was the most sophisticated one. The Apple first computer here. That was a camera, typical camera back then. Sony, the Walkman. That's the telephone that we had. You know what that is? What is that? Mobile phone. That's the first cellular phone ever. Okay? You know who did it? You remember? Motorola. Motorola did it. And there was an interview to the chief engineer who was holding that phone, and they asked him, "Are you concerned that the battery time is 10 minutes?" And he said, "No. Why? Because it's too heavy to have more than 1 minute conversation." It was a very heavy phone. At that time, in 1980, 1979, the story is that Kay Whitmore, the CEO of Kodak, goes to the Photo Marketing Association meeting, which is the annual meeting where everybody in the industry gets together. Companies introduce new products. All of the executives get together and talk. CEOs go. It's the big deal meeting that happens every year. So he goes there. Kodak obviously is always the king or the queen. It's the most important company in the industry, and always prominently featured. So Kay Whitmore walks around the stands, and at some point he sees that everybody is around that little stand. So he goes close, and he sees a little thing on a tripod there, sitting on the stand. Everybody was watching, and then he realizes that there is a big sign saying "For a Filmless Future," and that was the Sony Mavica. So number one, Sony never went to the Photo Marketing Association meetings before. Sony was not a photo company. Okay, it was not in the industry. Second, that was very unusual. Kodak was not the king for the first time, and there was that big sign for a filmless future. So, that got him really upset. So he goes back to Rochester, and this is a true story. Okay, so he goes back to Rochester. brings together all of his men and he says, we have to do something for this company. Sony is a pretty serious company. Remember, there was the Walkman that the company was producing, very well-known company everywhere, best TV, color TV in the world, the Trinitron, This is a pretty, high-level company. We can't really not consider it. So he goes back, brings everybody together. He hires 2 different consulting companies for 5 or 6 months. Okay, one was, McKinsey, the other, a smaller company. He brings together the best industry experts. So for 5 or 6 months, they really study off-site after off-site the situation. One day, he gets all of his best people together in a room and he tells them, from now on, here is my decision, okay? So right now, the R&D money is allocated in the following way. 5% to digital. Can you read? 5% to maybe I need a better, marker. 5% to digital and, at that time it was electronic technologies. They had barely a sense of, what digital was. Well, and, 95% was, our traditional imaging technologies, essentially chemical, From now on, we're going to move to, like 50% and 50%. So the move was from, 5.95 to 50-50. And he says, this is not going to be a short-term deal. This is going to be a long-run decision. In fact, I'm going to commit to do that for the next at least 10 years. This is a big decision. Okay, so he sees, thank you very much, he sees the Mavica, stand, Sony hires people, industry experts, and in 5 months, he gets to that decision. Now, my question to you is this a rational decision? What do you think? Is this, for a company like Kodak that is, number one quasi-monopolist in the US in the film technology and in the film business, which is obviously one of the most profitable businesses in the world. They see the Mavica. All they know about the Mavica is, literally what they see at that stand. In fact, that Mavica that they were showing was not really on. It was off. It was just, they were not really showing what it was doing. You go back to Rochester and you decide that. What do you guys think?
Well, I mean,
Do you have a mic, maybe?
we're running.
Yeah.
Thanks. Well, I mean, first I'd say he was really farsighted.
Uh-huh.
I mean, he saw the potential of the new,
So he saw the potential, okay?
but also he's a big risk taker because he's taken his core business and he's going to devote half of his R&D to something that
So
he
where
doesn't
is
know
the
anything
risk
about.
coming from? Why is it risky? Let me ask you another question. What would a rational decision, in your opinion, what should be a rational decision? What does rational mean in this context, in your opinion?
Well, I would, a
So,
rational...
you said something very important. He took a risk, and he was farsighted. He definitely tried to, he saw the potential. He didn't miss the Sony Mavic, that for sure. And I said, but that was a big risk. Now, sure, that was risky, but what does rational mean in this context? What does it mean?
Continuing to maximize shareholder wealth.
Okay, what does it mean concretely? How do you approach this decision?
So I'm not saying I agree with this, but
Okay.
if he was in the film business, if he really saw that this was a disruptive technology that was going to erode his business over time, to take the risk, he should have devoted 95% to digital and 5% to film.
So that would have been, in your opinion, a less risky decision, actually.
Well, I mean, we have the good fortune of being 20 years ahead. So.
Right. Now let's try to step back. At that time, based on what we knew at that time, obviously he took the decision in 1980. based on what we knew at that time, based on where we were at that time, and I'm asking everybody, what does it mean in this context to make a rational decision? What do we need to know? What do you think we need to know? Yeah.
The potential market for the digital imaging.
Potential market for digital imaging.
There might be new customers that would like digital that have never been in film, but they will love digital, and you'll have a whole new business that you don't even know about now.
Right. So there is one thing that we know. What's your name? Norm. There is one thing that we know about technology, which applies across the board to all technology, which has to do with technology evolution. Okay. The one thing that we know, which applies to at least 95% of the industries and of the technologies, is that technologies diffused in a kind of through an S curve. Okay. So typically, if there is an old technology, and you were talking about market, right, about market share, say, these are two competing technology. The threat here is a threat of substitution. So, in 1980, if this is 1980, Kodak was 100%, not Kodak, the film technology was 100%, to the extent that there is something called digital that comes in, that digital most likely is gonna come in this fashion. It's gonna diffuse through in that particular way, with that pattern, okay? Which means that, film is gonna follow if film takes off, okay? It's gonna follow in that particular pattern. It's gonna follow that particular pattern, okay? So my read of what you were saying, Norm, is that you're saying that, perhaps we need to know something about these curves if we want to be rational. Is that right?
Right, but I was also proposing that the whole thing could be bumped up as well.
Okay. So your hypothesis, you say, it's possible that there may be a future in which the two technologies are going to coexist, in which the pie is going to be bigger. So that's one possibility that we don't know about. So one possibility is that, this is not a substitution story. The two may actually complement each other. And there may be a future in which the pie is actually bigger, okay? The other hypothesis is, look, in those situations, typically the two technologies compete, okay? And if they compete, it means that, because they respond to the same underlying need, okay? Which is the need of, essentially, storing memories, so to speak, right? Most likely, in those situations, there is a substitution. So maybe I really like your point, but let's assume, to simplify the story, that, that this is going to be, we know back in the 80s that this is going to likely be a possible substitution story, okay? Let's assume that. If that is a substitution story, that's the way the substitution is going to happen. Now, yeah.
Oh, I was just going to respond about the rational piece of it.
Yes.
To me, the 10-year plan was not really rational.
Why is that?
Because I just think that he was forward-looking, but he was looking too far into the future.
So what do you think he needs to know?
That the inflection point was going to be sooner, and that he
that
should...
inflection point over there?
Right.
Is that the inflection point you're talking about?
Not even that particular one, but the point at which it's clear that that's what's going to happen to the curves, I guess I would say, and I don't know how you represent that on the curve.
Well, there is, you called it an inflection point. I mean, this is a key point, right? At this point, digital is going to be, more diffused and, more present than film. That's actually a very important point. And you're saying that, you're saying that we don't know when that's going to happen? Is that what you're saying?
Right, and 10 years seems to be too long to wait.
Too long. So what do you think?
Well, they had and frankly, I don't remember if the timing works, but they had acquired different companies over time, and so to my mind, I would think, okay, fine, go find someone who's figured this out or is close to figuring, and acquire that company and bring it in, and get
Companies
that knowledge.
Doing what? Company doing what? Because in 1980 there were no companies doing digital,
well, Sony
right?
had done it, so
Sony was,
maybe someone else. I don't know.
By the way, the Mavica was a dummy, okay? Sony didn't have a working camera. They presented a dummy, which was not even a working prototype. But anyway, so you're saying...
Or just think about ways that aren't a 10-year plan. Think about a 5-year plan or something.
But it seems, we have these two curves. You're saying, we don't know when that inflection point is going to happen. Can we say anything about, essentially the speed with which, say, the digital curve is going to kick in? Can we say anything?
We can look at the other context of similar technologies and patterns they've followed, like looking at the pictures up there, looking at personal computers.
Right.
That's a key piece to have in place. Why is it a key piece? Because in order to use a digital camera, you generally need a computer.
How many computers were in American families back then?
It was shooting up on that curve.
Shooting up on that curve, but it was still very small fraction of the American families having a personal computer.
Yes, but there have been years of development.
And we don't know, and it's very hard to predict how long it's going to take, right?
I would think there's be some historic data that you
Some historic data. So maybe that's a source of uncertainty, a key element, something that we need to know about, which introduces uncertainty.
And I would think there's also a critical mass.
A critical mass of people.
That you could look at, yeah.
Okay, so that's very important. Okay, so one of the things that digital imaging technologies do that standard cameras don't is, they allow, if there are computers, to, kind of wash the image right away. Okay, there were, instant cameras back then, but, they were, the traditional technology. This can, give you an image right away. And possibly, it can allow you to store all of your images in a hard drive. So knowing, how fast the computer is going to diffuse is very important. What else is important? What do you think? So if we are in the business of, essentially, trying and understand the shape of these curves and, the speed with which this curve in particular is going to hit. Okay? So what else is important?
Cost.
Cost.
And price
cost
point.
Of what?
How much it costs a consumer to get the technology.
Get the camera. How do you know about that?
Other technology. How much are the computers?
So what are the technologies in a digital camera? That's probably something you could say back then. So what were the technologies, the key ones?
Lens.
Lens, you know about lens. Actually, you're very good about lens.
Yep, the circuitry, which
circuitry,
is cheap.
The sensor. Okay? And then, the storing devices. So sensors and storing, two key technologies. You knew that you needed a sensor. You didn't know much about what a sensor really is back then. Okay? So in 1980, you knew that you needed something like a sensor, but what a sensor is was not very clear.
My answer takes it in a different direction. I'd want to know what the board's appetite for risk was.
It's a very good question, and the board, in fact, gave Mr. Whitmore a very hard time at that time. So they were not too happy about it. Okay? Yes?
So I think that it was a rational decision when he made it. Rational.
Good to see. Yeah.
But he was kind of screwed because he was in the midst of a revolution that he didn't know about.
Yeah.
So Kodak was founded at a time when you brought a new technology to market, you had a huge advantage for a long time.
Right.
In the digital era that was to come, the first company to bring a new technology to market almost always loses. So they're going to invest billions of dollars in digital technology, which he thinks is the future. That's great.
Right.
But they're not going to reap that advantage.
So,
but he doesn't know it.
But I guess you're saying, you first said, that's a rational decision, but at the same time you said, they shouldn't have done it.
No, I'm saying it was a rational decision with the information he had at the time.
So let's try to reason with the information that they had at the time. You think it was rational?
Yeah.
Okay. Any other voice? Okay.
I think that, I think that the CEO had to weigh two distinct issues. The first we've all been talking about, which is some assessment of the probability that this is the way the market's going to evolve and the associated timing. But the second is Kodak as a company needed to decide if it does go in that direction, what's the probability that we will succeed in this area. We're an optics and imaging company, but not a software company.
Not a software company, not an electronics company, so that would require a major transformation of the capabilities of the company, which is something that he implicitly responded to, we can make it. but that's a big assumption. You see how many assumptions are we making here? Diffusion of PC, something that I didn't hear that I think is absolutely critical here is image quality. I mean, image quality is the driver of the whole thing. The film industry hinges on the quality of the pictures that a particular film allows you to take, right? All of the innovation is geared towards quality, and here the only thing you know is that right now quality is close to zero. Not knowing what a sensor is, it's impossible to say how long it's going to take for consumers to accept the fact that if you want to store and share images, have to take pretty crappy pictures. We don't know that. Storage, we don't know that. Emails and internet, at that time there was no such a thing as internet, although I did a long study with Polaroid, and I dig the old archives of the company, fascinating company, and there is a document that dates back to 1979 in which these technology geeks were talking about basically emails. Okay, so there was in the high-tech sort of domains, a little bit of a notion that one day we might be able to send, stuff from a computer to another computer. But we are talking about industry and technology visionaries here. I guess that what I'm saying is that it's very hard in 1980 we know, it's a good assumption maybe to say, well, there are good reasons to think that digital imaging one day is going to hit. That's just an assumption that I can tell. It's very hard to say when it's going to hit. It could be 10 years down the road, 15, 20, 35, 45, or 50. We don't know. In 1999, I interviewed the 10 big industry experts that everybody in the industry recognizes the best people who know the industry. In 1999 or 2000, around that time. So I asked them, precisely this question. When do you think that this point I, say inflection, is going to happen? And I asked that question in 99, which was here. It's kind of, we probably don't remember, but in 99 we were still taking pictures with film inside the camera. How variation do you think I got in the answer in 99? A lot, a little, significant. We were around, say, here. Maybe it was, digital was like 25 and 75 image. Significant. So basically I got people who said 3 years and people who said never. And people who said 20 years. I think that the median answer was 18 years or something like that. I'm talking about 1999, yes.
If it's hard to look through the retrospectoscope, a good mental exercise might be, when's the driverless car going to come around? Because that's currently, in a similar earth-changing way, another way that you can think of that. And the spectrum's still the same. Never to it's going to happen in 10 years.
Right, exactly. So what do you do, though? I mean, what is the implication of that in terms of the actual decision of how much to invest in digital imaging?
Yeah.
It's unclear.
Exactly.
There is one picture that really disturbs me in the case. That if you look at, so we're looking here at the substitution between the two technologies. But if you look at film and you consider time here and market share here. Kodak was practically 100% at the beginning of this story, and Fuji was practically zero. Okay? So if you look at the evolution of this, the moment that Kodak starts to devote money, resources, both R&D and managerial resources to digital imaging, the film business, the most profitable business in the world, okay? Film is, mind-blowing in terms of the profitability. The market share starts to decrease. Why? Because Fuji got better than Kodak. Why? Because Fuji was allocating more R&D money than Kodak. Why? Because Kodak didn't care any longer about film. So I interviewed 10 people at Kodak asking them, do you think that Fuji was stoppable? They said, of course. But, we were only thinking about, digital. All of the managerial attention was on digital. So there is a big cost up there, this kind of, foreshadowing of the future or anticipation of the future on the part of Kay Whitmore, represented for the company. progressively losing essentially the stronghold in film. So, this discussion, and if you ask me what is rational, my answer is, Sony is a serious company. They had a dummy at that time, but we know that they had, it's a good company with good technology, and so I wouldn't have taken that threat, lightly, so number one. So you have to do something, Actually, Kodak already knew something about digital technologies. They were investing in in the 70s already, and so they had some notion that the digital revolution could come, but so certainly you have to do something, and my heuristic here would be do everything, invest everything you can as soon as you don't lose leadership in the most profitable business in the world. So you're leader, you're number one. You want to be ahead of the game there. If you have additional resources that you can invest in digital, and you have those resources, then invest those resources in digital. But all these discussions so far, to make a very simple point, the point that the hypothesis that there might be some irrationality going on here. Do we all agree that there might be some irrationality here? Or let's stipulate that there might be some irrationality for now, okay? Now, I just asked you a silly question. So let's see if that silly question can help us understand that irrationality. Okay, so what question did I ask? A large car manufacturer has recently been hit with a number of difficulties, and they're in trouble, they need to be closed, and, 6,000 employees laid off. And yes, this exactly, he or she has these options. Option A, the plan will result in the loss of 2 of the 3 plants and 4,000 jobs. So, if we have, say, 0 jobs here and 6K jobs here and, 2K jobs here, plan A says, well, the option is that with probability 1, you're going to get, only 2,000 jobs left, okay? Plan B says, well, with probability, say, 1/3, with probably 2/3 probability, you're going to end up with 0 jobs. And with probability 1/3, you're going to end up with 0 people leaving the company, basically with everybody. You don't have to fire anybody. So these are the 2 options, plan A here and plan B here. What's the difference between these 2 plans? What's the difference? They're the same? What's the difference?
Level of risk.
Level of risk. One is risky. There is some uncertainty about whether you're going to get all of the people or no people. Okay? And the other, for sure that you're going to get, only 2,000 people. You're going to have to fire 4,000 people. Okay, so I ask you, these questions. What do you think is the most likely answer here?
A.
A. Who said A? Why?
Because the probability of losing everybody is higher in plan B and...
Well, plan A, you're going to end up with 2,000 jobs, right?
Right.
Now, if you do an expected, value calculation, in plan B, that's 2,000 too. Because you have 1/3 probability of not losing anybody and 2/3. So the expected value is absolutely identical. The difference, is the level of risk.
So that's true.
Do you think that, most people are risky or not risky?
Not risky. Most people are risk averse.
Risk averse. So, most people are going to get A. Is that right?
No.
No? Why no?
Me?
Yeah, you.
Oh, because I think that I'm going to lose my job anyway if I have to fire 4,000 people. So if I have a chance of being a hero, and I could say, well, I tried to save
You tried
everybody.
to save some people, yeah.
So I think that, I'm kind of toast anyway, so I might as well.
So what would have you done?
I do B.
You do B. You do B because maybe you can save everybody, right?
And it's a better story.
Because, it's a better story to tell. Yeah. So nice people, think that B is better. Yes?
Well, I think the other, plan A, I choose plan A because you have a 100% chance of the opportunity to regroup and figure out what you screwed up. So you're still going to survive, at least temporarily.
And the other, you may not survive.
Right, you may not survive.
You may have to close the company. You may lose your job, you see?
I lose my job anyway.
Yeah, you think you're going to lose anyway.
4,000 people.
All right, so, interesting.
I mean,
Anybody else wants to comment on this? No. Okay, good. Now, the reality is that I gave half of you that question, okay? And the other half, I gave you this other question here. Can you all read here, down here? Okay, so let me take this down, out of your way. All right, thank you. So, question 1A is, identical to question 1. So you are, facing the exact same problem. You're facing the exact same options. The only difference, okay, is very subtle. Look at how I phrased this question here. I said this plan will result in the loss of 2 of the 3 plants. I said, this plan will save 1 of the 3 plants and do 2,000 jobs. Okay, so, in one case I said loss, in another case I said save. The numbers are identical, the expected values are identical, the options are identical, but in both questions here I used loss, and in both questions here I used save. Okay? Now, suppose you have a distribution of people saying, be here, and suppose that distribution is like 30% of the people take a risk. Do you think it's more likely to take a risk here or here? In other words, is this higher than 30% or lower than 30%? Who said higher? So if I tell you save, you're more likely to take a risk. Why is that?
I think it's a more optimistic way of looking at the solution.
So I phrased the question in more optimistic terms, right? Okay, and so what?
Is that a question?
Yeah, so why do you take more risk if I frame the question in more optimistic terms?
I'm just a happy kind of guy,
What is the psychological difference between this way of phrasing that question and this way of phrasing the question? So if I phrase the question, and by the way, you can, I used, loss and save, but you can think about threat and opportunity. That's effectively what I'm inducing here a threat versus an opportunity. Now, if you frame something as a threat, psychologically, what's the difference between framing something as a threat, something as an opportunity, psychologically? I can tell you that there is a big difference. This is actually one of the most important experiments in the modern history of psychology, okay, which gave the Nobel Prize to the people who created it. What's the psychological difference between...
The word you choose focuses your mind on a certain outcome.
All right.
I mean, I'm reminded of Gil and when he was talking about, am I 97% likely to be healthy or am I 3% likely to be ill?
Okay.
So which side of a percentage are you talking about?
Now, okay, so let's double click here. You're right. What does it mean? So tell me what's the psychological difference between I tell you that event is, I frame that event as an opportunity versus a threat. When you frame something as a threat, what is that you're assuming? If you frame something as a loss, what is that you are assuming?
That it will happen.
Huh?
That it is likely to happen.
That is likely to happen.
Yeah. But I think if it's, framed as an opportunity, it seems like there's still a chance that we can fix and it's also the part of the brain, I think, that reacts.
So let's stick with the loss now. So you frame something as a loss, okay? What are you fundamentally assuming for a loss to exist?
That the positive scenario is not possible. I mean, so it just seems like that the negative is, there's no other option.
Negative compared to what? There is one way that we as human beings can derive pleasure or utility or disutility, always against a reference point.
Right.
Okay? Right. Now, if I frame something as a threat or as a loss, what's my reference point?
There isn't one. But
there isn't one?
No, in this...
What you have now. There is a none or what you have now. Is it the status quo or nothing?
Right, but in the positive...
No, there is a status quo or nothing. That's a key question. So if I frame something as a loss, my reference point is the status quo or nothing. Status quo, right? I hug the status quo, and I'm induced to think about that particular event while I hug the status quo. Say, that's the status quo. If that happens, I'm going to lose something, right? Opportunity means what? What's the reference point? Huh? Nothing. Goes to zero. Opportunity goes to zero. The reference point is, I can only gain, right? So the same exact event here, what I induced I induced some people to think about the same exact thing in terms of a reference point that is the status quo. So you hug the status quo, right? And other people thought about it from the point of view of there being no status quo, or the status quo being zero. So, it's only an opportunity. It's a gain. Now, that's the fundamental psychological difference in the framing of the two problems. It turns out, that number one, you can frame, inducing people to frame something as a threat or as an opportunity is relatively easy. So you as the leader of a company or of a group can easily induce people to think about an event, typically a disruptive or a discontinuous event, in terms of either a loss or a gain, very easily. And number two, the implications, the behavioral implication of these two things are huge. Which one do you think is more likely to conduce to risk? When you hug the status quo, or when you think about the world in terms of a gain, an opportunity? Which one do you think is more likely to induce to more risk-taking? Based on your hunch, on your instinct. Status quo. Why is that? This is, by the way, Amos and Turkey, right? So what's the story? Can you explain me the story? You forgot the story? So what's the story here? That, with respect to a loss, that we don't like to take losses. That people hate to take losses. So you can frame the same thing, exact thing, as an opportunity. And therefore, if you don't like to take losses, you're taking a risk because you want to avoid that scenario badly, so badly that you take a risk, right? That's only because, the framing and the default starting point of this thinking process, I influenced, and I, induce people, induce people to, think about that in terms of the status quo. We are risk averse. In fact, I did this exercise with, hundreds of either executives or MBA students, and some of my students are here. Maybe you remember something, maybe not. But and this is pretty much the difference. When you frame something as a loss, as a threat, you take way more risk than when you frame the same exact identical thing as an opportunity. And again, the beauty of this thing is that you as a leader can easily, induce the people that you're working with to frame things one way or another. Huge implication for your attitude towards risk. Okay? So that's one thing. Now, think about, again, the world in terms of, think about your experience, in terms of opportunity versus threat. Do you see any other implications of, this differential framing beyond just risk-taking? Does it ring a bell? When you frame something as a big threat, how do you feel?
Compelled to act.
Compelled to act. Yes, you feel compelled to act. Do you feel cognitively, mentally playful? Why? You're focused on survival. So you're not playful.
No.
And what does it mean when you're not playful?
You may not be making the best decisions.
Why is that?
Because you're focused on survival.
Focus on survival. Your focus of attention narrows as, as the more you frame something as a threat, the narrower your focus of attention is, right? The lower your mental creativity, your mental playfulness. Let me tell you a story. My students may have heard that story. I got my first job in 2000. So I joined HBS in 2000, and I started teaching, in 2000. Okay, so teaching cases is typically not easy, and teaching cases at HBS as a rookie is very difficult. Students are there to look for blood, and in fact they found a lot of blood, when I was teaching. So it was like 2 or 3 weeks into the course, and bleeding. But I had learned something actually that, by working 24 hours a day pretty much, I could survive. I was kind of bleeding but surviving. But, because I was working like crazy. Now, 3 weeks into the game, I received a phone call from, a strategy guru who was, like one of those, Nobel Prize winners that says, well, we have this round table, this workshop, there are 12 people, and they were all, he named them, they were all, the people that were up there, the best people in the world for me, and said, so you just got, this job, I've seen your work, I'm interested in it, we're all interested in it, can you come and present it to us? So, you can imagine that I framed it immediately as a mortal threat. So I said, okay, so great, thank you very much. But, number one, I couldn't say no. Number two, mentally, I said, well, this is going to kill my career. This is literally going to kill my career. So framed that as a huge threat, I stopped investing in the MBA course, which was a, very non-risky, course of action, because I knew with probability 1 or close to 1 that had I continued to invest there, I would have gotten something out of it, okay, survival. On the other hand, I already had a quasi-perfect presentation of all of my work that I had perfected in months and months of work. When you go on the job market, obviously, you work pretty hard at your stuff. And, so improving that was close to impossible. Yet I spent 2 weeks working 24/7 on that presentation. Okay? So, so you can imagine the results in the MBA classroom. I mean, I don't want to even remember that. But, the interesting thing, back to what you, Ahmed, said, I couldn't make a single improvement to that presentation. I was cognitively stuck. I was totally rigid. I'm pretty playful, generally. I was totally unplayful. And that happened 2 weeks of, very hard and painful, hours trying to get, some improvement. But, I was mentally stuck. So there is a lot of work on, behavioral work, psychological experiment on the so-called threat rigidity that show that the moment you frame something as a threat versus an opportunity, your mind freezes. You stop being creative. Even if you're the most creative person in the world, you stop being creative. So you see, we have two, very simple, there is a very simple phenomenon here. Threat versus opportunity, framing of a big disruption, of a big event, which you can easily manage, that has enormous behavioral implication on you and on the people that work with you. Again, threat, big risk taking, and cognitive rigidity. Opportunity, essentially neutrality with respect to risk, and creativity. Now, you have read the case. Do you think that and these two behavioral results have something to do with Kodak? Yes.
What you were talking about.
Yeah, absolutely.
You were talking about Sony, putting that up. Could he have perceived the threat as much bigger than it really was? Mm-hmm. Because he was the king, he was unthreatened, and now here he was being threatened with the prospect of his business being wiped out.
Right.
By somebody with good means, but not a competitor that he knows.
So you're saying, that one of the reasons, so you're saying two things, it seems to me. Number one, that, in fact, Kodak framed that as a major threat, right? And that is consistent with, the behavioral implications that we know are associated with threat versus opportunity. Okay? Kodak took an enormous risk. They in fact began to lose film as I lost the MBA classroom. That's the analogy. Okay? They did exactly the same thing over the years. For something, now where is the chart, that in 1999, okay, the best people in the industry did not have a clue where that inflection point would happen. So they made those investments starting in 1980. That sounds to me like gambling. So they took an enormous risk. And you're saying that one of the reasons why they did it, that they were the king. And the sheer notion of somebody challenging my core business is, I have a lot to lose. Do you think that they could have framed that as an opportunity? Had Whitmore known about all of this that we're talking about, do you think that they could have?
I would have probably created something else on the outside, much smaller, and say, I will grow this.
Like a small experiment.
Yes.
Which is probably can be perceived as an opportunity, right? We have an opportunity to do something new here in imaging. We have our core business that's unchallenged. We're not going to touch that, but maybe we can do that. Something along those lines, right?
Yes.
In a small kind of way.
So opportunity to grow something instead of protecting something else.
Protecting something, grow versus protecting. I really like that. Now, do you see any other evidence associated and consistent with the lack of creativity that we know, big threat framers, always lose? Do you see anything in the case that, is suggestive of Kodak being cognitively sticky, cognitively inert, mentally rigid? Yes.
So they really took the film concept and tried to apply it to digital. So when they started with the photo CD, they were basically applying the same concept just to the digital
So what
world.
is photo CD?
So a CD where you, instead of a film, you have the photos on an actual CD.
So, in 2000, I was at that Photo Marketing Association, okay? And I talked with, pretty much all of the Kodak people that I could find there. All, middle to senior managers. They were all talking about photo CD. Now, can you think that you can make money with a commodity? What is a CD? That's a commodity. I mean, film is not a commodity. Film is one of the most complex technologies, in chemical industries. It's very complex. Only you could do that film. Anybody could come in with a CD. I could never understand why all of these very smart people in 2000, essentially, were all thinking that the company, hinged upon the success of photo CD. So there must have been something going on, and I think you're totally right. That something going on is, the impossibility for them to think that you can make money in photography with hardware, with a camera. Not with the software. They had a software mindset, a consumable mindset. I was talking with, a former CEO of Polaroid, actually, who, has the same story, very similar story. And it was 2001 or 2000. So I was talking with this man, a fantastic man, a gentleman, Mr. McCune, and, he says to me, we're sitting, before we start the conversation, he told me, before we start the conversation on digital imaging, let me tell you one thing. Nobody at Polaroid today understands that there is no money outside of consumables in photography. So, he couldn't see any other way of making money because, that's the way they cognitively had been used to, think about the world back then. It's one of the most extreme, in my view, in my experience, one of the most extreme cases of cognitive inertia that I've ever found, certainly exacerbated by that, framing of digital imaging as an enormous threat. I'm going to show you a little clip of George Fisher
in 93, and one of the first things you did was a radical change at the top of the company. What motivated that change?
Several things. Need being number one. We had an early retirement program called the R program at Kodak, which was put in place before I got there. But by the time I got there, we had lost much of our top management, especially in the finance area and some in the product business areas. Therefore, it was necessary to just backfill, and it was an opportunity to bring, especially into finance, some skill from the outside where I really wanted an independent view of where we were. And we did that by hiring Harry Kvetis, who was treasurer of IBM at the time, and bringing in, he was the head of IBM Credit Corp at the time, and bringing in Jesse Green, who was assistant treasurer of IBM at the time. And they really built up a finance organization from scratch almost, which was very effective. And then on the product side, it was time, given the opportunity, to bring in some digital expertise besides me. So we brought in Carl Guston, and we brought in eventually Willie Shee, and we brought in many others who had some comfort level and experience and enthusiasm for digital photography.
Did this change had anything to do with cognitive inertia at the top? We are a razor blade company. All the money is in the blade, not in the razor, and so forth and so on.
Yes, the cognitive inertia aspect wasn't something that I consciously thought of at the time. Mm-hmm. Thanks to your writings, I've thought about it since. But it was certainly a factor in trying to bring in people with different ways of thinking from different companies. It's also one of the reasons, although a secondary one, of why I didn't bring in a lot of Motorola people. I didn't want everybody thinking like I thought, and as it turned out, that was a smart move, but it was also a right thing to do. I just don't believe in stealing people from the company you just came from.
Right. Okay, so that was probably not the main reason.
No, no.
In retrospect, is there anything you would have done differently to fight this cultural and cognitive resistance?
Well, unfortunately, I didn't recognize it early enough. Clearly, the top management team that we had put together was aligned and believing in what we were trying to do. And the people lower in the organization, whether it's in the factories or in the labs around the world, were begging for top management to do something. And they seemed very aware of the digital world coming at them. What I didn't realize for some time was that the middle management, and these are good people, by the way, not bad people, very highly trained, skilled people. But I guess because of the threat to them, the fear that they possessed, both about Kodak's ability to participate in the brave new world of digital imaging, and about their personal ability to transfer their skill sets into that world. I think that fear drove paralysis that manifested itself as time went on into just rigidity with respect to changing to our strategy. And I didn't see that at the start because Kodak's a very polite culture and people don't confront you generally with disagreements. They are more passive aggressive. Therefore, once we realized, or I realized at least, what was going on, we really had to work very aggressively to get middle management, first of all, understanding what we were trying to do and believing that this was a story of opportunity, that we were in the picture business, that digital was just a technology, just like film was, and that picture business opportunity was gigantic and there was a future for them. And then getting them to sell that story to their people, that was a very proactive attempt to re-engage middle management. In some cases, we had to let people go who just couldn't get past the change aspect.
So what was their argument? What did they say? I'm just trying to figure a conversation between you and...
Their arguments would be all over the map, but basically Kodak can't succeed in this market. We've tried some consumer products before. We failed miserably. There's no money in this business. It's all low margin business. How can we ever deal in that space? There's a new set of competitors there. We don't know anything about them. Or on a personal level, it was, hey, I don't know anything about that. I've worked 30 years. I'm not about to learn it now.
Right.
Although the latter, that last set of emotions rarely came out, but it was very real.
So you think that there was some even hidden sabotage, perhaps? Or it was more...
I never saw an example of sabotage. If there was, these are good and nice people, and I don't think they would overtly sabotage things. Would they subconsciously sabotage things? Perhaps. I can't cite an example of that.
Lack of motivation, perhaps, lack of commitment.
And lack of selling to your people, your team, the conviction that we're on a good track.
Comments? Yes.
So I have a comment. In all this process, did Kodak ever step back and say, what is it we're really good at? This whole new technology comes along that's electronic based, and here they are trying to compete in a medium that they have no experience in. They're a chemical company.
Yeah.
And did they ever step back and say, we're really good at chemicals, what can we do? This would be like Hermes, which made bridles for horses, deciding to get into the bumper business for cars, which... So...
No, it's a very good question. Did they have the right organizational skills, the right capabilities to pursue essentially, the digital revolution? I think it's a fairly open question. We don't have we don't know. But one thing that makes me fairly comfortable, to say that they actually did at some point acquire the right capabilities, is that Sony was coming to Rochester to buy sensors at some point, actually fairly early in the game. So it means that the company acquired major capabilities in a domain that they were not used to quote unquote own. So that's number one. Number two, they tried multiple times to merge with big companies. There was a big failed merger in 1999 with HP. So they went until the very last step, and then at the very last minute HP withdrew from the game. So it means that at some level they were thinking about it. But and they did a few acquisitions of smaller players that certainly helped them put together manufacturing capabilities. Okay, they had great technological capabilities. I guess your point is, can we manufacture those in a large scale? So overall, I think that there is this. We don't know. We will never know an answer because the company ultimately was unsuccessful. So they never really got to the point of competing with, say, Nikon or Leica or other companies at that game. But I think that the reason for that has little to do with the manufacturing capability. It has more to do with the way they were approaching mentally the problem. And to me, the one thing, as I said, that makes me fairly confident that was not the key problem, in addition to talking to the managers, okay? So, they didn't feel that was a problem. Okay, so to your precise question, did they ever think about it? From Fisher on, the leading team was not thinking about that as a problem. Okay, but beyond that, what makes me feel comfortable that they were fairly right with that assessment is the fact that companies like Sony was coming to buy their equipment. So it means that they were good at something, right? So I really think that in other words, that the ultimate cause of the problem is, we can't really get to the point of accepting that, in our industry, there is no such a thing as, the possibility of making money selling hardware and non-software. So you never get past the notion of a filmless future, I think. That's my interpretation of the story. Questions? Yes?
I think one of the things at the very end of the interview, you asked him, you said, so were the middle managers not motivated?
Right.
And I think motivation, I think lots of times we assume that middle managers are not motivated when it's really about skills, knowledge, and confidence. And I think that that's like the most important thing that you can give your middle managers is the confidence, the skills, and the knowledge to do what they need to do.
That's a great point, a great observation. You know, I teach a course on cognition, an elective class, and I use part of that precisely to illustrate the pathologies of not giving people confidence. So I think that you hit upon a very important point. In my view, the cognitive inertia, the cognitive resistance is, probably the primary factor historically, but there certainly is. And Fisher actually talked about, rigidity, about, them being threatened, but there certainly is an element of confidence too. Yes, I agree with you.
This is really a failure of them losing sight of their why.
Can you say it again?
This is a failure of them losing the understanding of why. Like Sinek talks about starting with why. And he alludes to it. They're really in the business, not of chemicals. Peter, they are a chemical company, but they're in the business of images and memory.
Right.
And whatever the medium that is.
Right.
We're in the business of healthcare delivery.
Exactly.
So that's where we get in trouble. I think the risk is that leaders, we don't empower our middle manager and then the frontline folks to understand why we're doing what we do.
Okay. So in other words, you're saying, if I understand you correctly, is, for them to understand what to do and to be motivated to do what to do, the identity of the organization needed to shift, right? Because, what he's talking about, Fisher, is we are an imaging company, we are a picture company, we're in the picture business, not in the film business.
Correct.
And that never really changed.
That didn't change.
That didn't change. I think it's a great point, actually, and, thank you for pushing in this direction. In fact, I also wrote the Fujifilm case, and the comparison between the two is, fascinating. I have a slide here, that shows that. So, look at the comparison. Okay, Fuji and Kodak pre-digital are pretty much identical, okay? So Fuji is the Kodak of Japan, of Asia. There are monopolies there, The only difference, look at that, you hit upon that, is, Kodak conceives of itself as a film company. So we are a film company.
Oh, strange.
Fuji, we are an information and imaging company. Okay? That's a very different cognitive starting point. Conceiving yourself in terms of your narrowly defined product, which, by the way, has been very successful for a long time. I mean, naturally induces you to hug the status quo. So for a filmless future, is a natural threat to your identity, to you. It's not surprising that the first reaction of Whitmore, and as a result, the whole organization was, we want to hug the status quo. So we framed the whole thing as a loss potential, as a threat, with all of the behavioral implications that has. Fuji has a very different mindset. We are an imaging and film company. So anything that happens technologically under the sun is actually good. It's fun for us. Opportunity. The status quo is very diffused. It's not, film. And as a result, they, number one, see the difference in investment. Two identical companies, 150%, huge bet, gambling. The other, reasonable investment, but, within bounds. Interestingly, while both companies before had endorsed a very strong, and very strongly, like a razor blade mindset, blade is the money. Where the money is, we ultimately produce blades more than razors. For Fuji, it was not difficult to give up that mindset and start to sell cameras. Fuji had the first camera sold in the Japanese market. And we know, that Kodak has a different story. So I think that element of, we have an identity that, number one, induced us to think about the war in terms of a threat. And number two, we never successfully changed. And that's, I think, the real mistake of Fisher, the real problem. He was psychologically not well equipped to understand, how to change the identity of a company, how to communicate that, how to talk to people. And in fact, one of the things that I talk about in my, in my course, other course, is, how do you understand, how can you understand the way people think so that you can, tell them in a way that is not likely to cause resistance, that in fact you need to move out of your historical identity. I think that was a big mistake on Fisher's part, and he knows that. Yes. Yeah.
So, here we go. So first, a disclaimer. I actually lived in Rochester and practiced medicine there from 1986 to 2008.
Oh,
so
fantastic.
I saw this play
The whole
out.
story.
So I have
sad story.
a little hard feelings against these guys because Rochester really declined as a city, as a place to live. And by the way, Xerox made similar mistakes and missed the digital revolution. So those were the two biggest industries. And I just wanted to expand on Kevin's point. One thing that's missing in all their comments is the voice of the consumer, the voice of the customer. And Eastman had a great vision. He wanted to make photography easier for the masses. So he invented the flexible film, etc. And then they got stuck making film. They didn't realize that digital made things even easier.
Even easier, right.
And then and all the denial and cognitive inertia you mentioned, they would come out to be in the newspapers. Right. Film, we're going to sell film in the foreign countries because the developing countries, there'll be demand for film, but they leapfrogged. Oh wait, we'll still make medical imaging film.
Right.
Because there'll still be a demand in medical. Well, that went away. So I think they lost sight of that voice of the customer.
Right.
And now, I think as you're starting to say, Kevin,
they were so focused on themselves in a sense.
Yes, everything in here is what should we do, what should we do versus them, what should we do versus ourselves.
That's a good point.
And now, if we lose sight of the voice of the customer in healthcare, I think we face the same problems.
That's a very good point. That's, in fact, my question now, that you heard my story, and I can quickly kind of wrap it up saying that basically there are, the lessons for me are very simple here, that when there is a disruption or a major event like a technological change like that, companies have basically free there are free possibilities. They ignore it, they frame it as an opportunity, or they frame it as a threat. You can view about the possible, options in terms of these free categories. 1 and 3 are generally problematic. So that's the first point. Ignoring or framing things as a threat are generally problematic. Although, I'm not saying that framing events like that as a threat is always bad. There are situations, actually I taught this case to a group of consultants a couple of years ago. And, and they said, wow, there are situations in which we find clients that are totally, inert from an action standpoint, that are reluctant to go, that are reluctant to jump on things, that are reluctant to move. If you frame something as a threat with that urgency, you can get them to take risks that they would not naturally take. Obviously, you have to be aware of the pathological implications associated with the lack of creativity, in addition to sometimes excessive risks. So I guess that my point is, I wouldn't say that one is always good and one is always bad, but typically ignoring and framing as a threat is more problematic than not. But more generally, I guess that my message to you is ultimately about the being very well aware that, as I said before, that framing is very easily to induce in other people. And that framing has, major behavioral implications that we know about, that we are certain about. I mean, there is huge, behavioral evidence supporting that. And one is risk and cognitive inertia, and the other is neutrality with respect to risk and more creativity. That's my message. You should be aware of that. Anytime you face a situation similar. But now that you have my story, I guess that my curiosity, we have a few minutes, is as to whether you see similar dynamics in your business. Yes.
So just to drill down to the implication point there, because I was fascinated about the difference between Kodak and Fuji. And we see Fuji in the digital world and Kodak not in the digital world. And it stems from Fisher's standpoint of saying, well, my middle managers were frozen. They were saying I can't do that. And the question is who's actually being unreasonable? Okay, first off. And
what do you mean by that?
In other words, is it unreasonable for them to say, hey, I do chemicals here. How is this a reasonable question? Because
for Kodak.
For Kodak, because the question is from moving from strategy to execution.
Yeah.
From you to Chris Trimble, right? Into the execution world, you have to move from mindset to people.
Exactly.
So my question is related to. It's not so much that, well, Fuji had a great mindset. Were there actual different people who they hired on to say, you're absolutely right, you're not in this business and I need to find a different team or have the special team in a similar way to healthcare? Because I totally agree with you, the mindset thing is totally important.
Right.
But the implication of that is not simply say, well, have a new mindset there, guy, and we'll get into digital together.
Well, I guess, the first point with respect to what you said on Kodak is that, let's not, I may have given you the wrong impression here. It's not that people didn't want to go or jump on digital imaging, okay? The company was sold on digital imaging from the get-go, okay? Fisher says, people were begging for solutions. So, it's not that they were not jumping, but they had jumped on digital imaging with the wrong mindset, all right? So, Fisher didn't have to convince people, hey, there is a digital revolution, we should, be aware of that and we should play in that game. He could have and should have persuaded them to understand that there can be such a thing as profitability in photography while selling cameras or selling printers, which was the idea underlying the HP versus Kodak merger. So that's actually a very important distinction. If you ask me what's the implication of this, well, there is a broad implications, as I said before, with respect to, threat versus opportunity framing. The second implication is that, your identity is very important affects the way you obviously think. It's the default way that you think about the world. And that identity is not neutral when it comes to framing events. And that's something not obvious. That, often, CEOs or, high executives don't really think about. So that's the other implication. And the third implication, with respect very concretely to Fisher, persuasion is very important. So moving from strategy to implementation here, a very important implication is, well, you really need to understand how to talk to people. Had he talked to people, if you ask Fisher now, what is your mistake? He would tell you, I didn't know how to talk to people. My mistake number one was, to be right on the identity dimension, but not being able to get people to be with me, right? Yes.
So if we think about healthcare as an analogy, and the disruptive innovation is we're moving from pay for volume to pay for value, the cognitive rigidity is the fact that many health systems haven't completely embraced this. In fact, we are increasing risk-taking by doubling down on orthopedics and cancer and other centers that we know are going to bring us more revenue under the total current system today. Would you say that that's fairly analogous to Kodak?
I don't know. I ask you, it sounds to me that it is, but I ask you guys, what do you think about it? Is that the analogy with healthcare?
I think the analogy is also with CVS providing healthcare and sort of, because one question I was going to ask you is whether you see this more in monopolists or close to so that, there's the company town, they're the only ones who do this. No wonder their identity was so strong in that way. And so I think even though we have multiple providers of healthcare, all of a sudden you have CVS and Walgreens saying, hey, you guys aren't the only ones who can do this. Doctors and nurses and clinicians are the ones who can do it, but we can organize it and structure it and
disrupt to some extent.
Yeah. So yeah, definitely, you know, in the case of Kodak, it's an extreme case, right? It's an extreme case of a monopoly with an extreme identity that, you know, developed over many, many years. So the fact has to be recognized, right?
Yeah.
And, you know, it may be more difficult to change the identity of Kodak. In fact, it is more difficult to change the identity of Kodak than it is, you know, changing the identity of a company that has a much, you know, more diffuse sense of identity. So, you know, I want you to recognize that this is an extreme case, you know. It's very extreme that in 2000 somebody comes to me, very smart people, saying, you know, we can make money with CDs. You know, that's very extreme. And it has to do with, you know, but the behavioral regularities that underlie, you know, the dynamics that we see at work in Kodak, that is not extreme. That is typically the case. And that's where I think I would like you, and that's where I would like you to think about healthcare. You know, is there an analogy here that we can draw, right? Yes.
Jeff, I wonder if is the challenge of making a transformation from pay for volume to pay for value, or get paid for volume versus get paid for value, is that a distraction? I think it's a distraction. I think what we're really talking about is back to, who said it, Rob, I guess, and we've talked about it. What is it that people want? What is it that businesses, who I agree with Mitt Romney on this, are people? What is it that businesses want, right? I mean, what it's about is people want, right, better outcomes, better health, at a price that they can afford before healthcare expenditures exceed total household income in 10 years. What was the number? So I worry sometimes that we chase the wrong thing. And my sense from conversations with Gail and Yaz and Austin is that they would agree that this is a transition, right? So I think we got to make sure that we're not playing the game, but that, right, we really know what the goal is.
That's very interesting. From the outside, you know, I'm not an expert of healthcare, but from the outside, it seems to me that actually is the critical sticking point in your industry. But again, you know, I'm here. I asked you because I want to learn about it. I'm not an expert in healthcare. So yeah.
I would just say that, you know, the perception that I get is that current healthcare providers feel threatened. They don't know where the future is going to be. It might be what we've talked about, pay for value instead of pay for quantity, but they just feel threatened. I mean, the pushback is there all the time. They don't see it as an opportunity. Right. They see it as a threat.
You think it's possible for them to see it as an opportunity?
Maybe.
Maybe. I really need to close, and because I really need to run to teach another class. This is precisely the kind of conversation that I would like you to have, and I hope that, you know, this case helps you unleash that kind of thinking. Anyway, I had a lot of fun, and thank you very much for having me here.